Great. So the thread I want to pick up is really about McDonald's wrestling through faith, action, and feeling. And these are not new themes, obviously, that we're seeing in him. A lot of us maybe grew up in faith traditions where they simplified that relationship of faith, action, and feeling. Some of us even remember felt boards in Sunday school where they made a little train and put them in the correct order, where you're supposed to have faith, then your feelings, then your actions, something like that. I don't even remember the order. But I remember it was really simple. And that's all you got to do is you just have to have these things in order and everything's fine, kind of like a magic 8 ball. If you just shake it right, then the correct answer kind of comes up to the top and your actions align with your feelings and your faith. But, faith is the engine, etc. So McDonald, especially in these 5 chapters, but we've already seen it being seeded throughout, is really poking holes in any kind of simplistic reduction of this. And he's using everybody in that process, including a kind of exposure of the narrator in his own feelings. Um, Throughout, we're getting this kind of like, I would be shocked to find that my feelings had impeded my duty to my parishioners. And then later, I am shocked that my feelings have exactly done what I was afraid of. And then you want to shake him by the shoulders and say, you're going to do the same thing because he's just going to like soldier on and ignore my feelings. And you're like, that didn't work. Come on, maybe try something else. So he's really playing with the nature of feelings, the nature of action and its roots, its relationship to faith. um, he's going to show that basically all kinds of reductions fail in their explanatory power. So we're not going to get good simplistic answers from MacDonald, but we are going to get holes poked in those typical kind of explanations. They don't touch the real experience of lived faith, feeling, and action. Just to name a few of the actors or you know, the characters in this play that he's talking about, that he's fielding or hosting. We have impressions, we have understanding, we have persons. Like, what are the things that are affecting faith, action, and feeling? We have relationships, we have postures, we have conscience, we have intention, will, circumstances, empathy, try and see. We have interventions, consequences, stakes. We have authorities. We have literary authorities, we have doctrine, we have Christ himself, we have commands, laws, customs, we have fear and self-protection and survival, we have unforgiveness, we have mortification, we have honor and shame, we have instinct, intuition, we have memory and forgetting, we have care for and don't care about anything, we have affections, tendernesses, and this new thing emerging in modern psychology, the subconscious. So these are all things that are interesting actors to begin teasing apart the nature of the experience of those relationships between faith, action, and feeling. It's not a little choo-choo train. So here's a good little quote to kind of start off. When I thought of a thing and I'd concluded I might do it, I very seldom put off the consequent action. I found I was very wrong sometimes, and the particular action did no good. But thus movement was kept up in my operative nature, preventing it from sinking towards the inactivity to which I was but too much inclined. Besides, to find out what will not do is a step towards finding out what will do. Moreover, an attempt in itself unsuccessful may set something or other in motion that will help. Keeping up this momentum in his quote operative nature is an ought. So he's telling himself it's better to do action instead of inaction. And he's overcoming a propensity to the opposite, inactivity, overthinking. We know that in Stoddard and others, he's critiquing the theorizing as compared to action as the ground of religion, true religion, spirituality. So doing something, even something that fails and does not work, as in will not do, is necessary to find out what might work, what will help. And this is a kind of almost a pragmatism, it seems like, in pastoral care, maybe even pragmatism in his spirituality. So this action versus inaction, we're clear where he kind of lands in that. Strong on the operative nature. We keep finding him rushing in and intervening in the lives of his parishioners in action and not really apologizing for the posture of doing that. And he's saying, in a way, too, inaction or the lack of motion is a thing that's most to be feared, most to be afraid of. So here's here from Paul Faber. Here's a little quote. But the more familiar one becomes with any religious system, while yet the conscience and will are unawakened and obedience has not begun, the harder it is to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Such familiarity is a soul-killing experience. So it's very clear that if you haven't the will and the action engaged, you're going and the things that could have been an impetus to that and the religious inputs in your life, if those have become so familiar that they don't move you to action, then it's soul killing. That's the real danger that he's fighting against. It's an analogy, of course, from MacDonald's very scientifically trained mind. Change is only possible as a kind of motion, but we're not obviously talking about literal physical motion. It doesn't affect the kinds of changes that he's interested in and the kind of change that's required in transformation of these characters. So transformation is a soul in analogical, even maybe anagogical motion. But what is to the soul as motion is to the body? That is the question. So, and for MacDonald, I believe it is story. Story is to soul as motion is to body. Therefore, a change of soul is precisely story development. It is character development in a story. That's how change or motion happens. Something happens in the plot. So from this, one can make the equally bold claim that spiritual transformation in our lives must take place in and through a story. So creating motion in the plots of characters' stories for MacDonald isn't just a matter of keeping the plot moving. It's something I think he believes at a much deeper level, which is people change because the stories keep them moving in motion, in development as the analogy for motion in the soul. So Alec Forbes, here's another good quote. He had yet to learn that through the heartache and thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, people became capable of the blessedness to which all the legends of a golden age point. So it's the stuff, it's the plots, it's the thousand natural shocks, it's the heartaches. That is the thing that's changing us. The vicar's interventions then are what set the soul's change in motion. And like I said, I don't believe this is just a plot device at a narrative level, but it's what MacDonald actually believes is involved in the transformation of actual persons in their lives. No plot, no change. No change, no development. Changes in our characters only change with changes in our stories, hence the need for the vicar to take an active rather than a passive role in the plots of his parishioners' lives. So that puts him, in a way, alongside God as author, who is the plot maker, the storyteller, the author and finisher of our faith, right? So he as vicar then is coming alongside and playing this role of interventionist in the lives of his characters in his parish. Listen to some of the responses to this intervention. So with Thomas Weir, but you don't know where to stop. If we lived 1,000 years, you would be driving a man on to the last. And there's no good in that, sir. A man must be at peace somewhen, which is a great word, somewhen. We don't use that much, but I'm going to start using it. Somewhen, somewhere, somewhen. So this friendship and pastoral care is a kind of almost purgatorial factor in the lives of his friends and the parishioners. He's meant to be what keeps us moving on, prevents us from falling back. We've already talked about sin is inertia and gravitational. It always goes one way. And we have to work against that. We have to, keep pushing them forward, onward. So this motif of moral progress requires effort to overcome inertia. And I also say purgatorial because of the 1,000. This is, almost an immediate reference to that same 1,000. The 1,000 years, the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is there too, the 1,000 heartaches. Later, we're going to hear about even sin's thousand failures and forgetfulness. So this thousand really stretches it out. And obviously, people who know a lot more about the theology of MacDonald will see this hint here of his purgatorial theology of God never taking his hands off of us, never giving up eternally toward wooing us towards our good out of goodwill and love for thousands of years, um, and thousands of natural shocks in order to bring us to our good. So that kind of participation in what is obviously what God's posture towards us is already is the vicar's justification in a way of why he has to get involved. And again, he says, better a wakeful anger and a wakeful conscience with it than an anger sunk into indifference and a sleeping dog of a conscience that will not bark. To have ceased to be angry is not one step nearer to your daughter. Better strike her, abuse her, with the chance of a kiss to follow. So the thing, again, to be feared is not the expressed, but the unexpressed emotion, the indifference, the falling down to that inertia. So in this sentiment, of course, he shows himself a little more culturally Scots than English, with the preference of indirect, non-expressive, kind of culture. But it's also a product of more modern psychology to think of things at work in the subconscious, right? So there's something under there. There's something at work. It's better to get it up and look at it, drag it into the light, and then we can all look at what this thing is, this emotion, this whatever thing that's moving you, and then we can deal with it. Apart from that, we can't do anything. We can't affect it. So the bringing into the light is prerequisite again for change. And he is throughout bringing his own feelings to light as well, to be fair, which he, does by saying, first the devil in Thomas Weir, the devil in Catherine, and then the devil in himself, or in the vicar. So he's really trying to speak about these feelings in ways that is probably pretty fresh and new during his day, that these things are subconscious, they're very powerful, they're not to be kind of ignored or taken lightly or squelched in a way. And he's going to be bringing these, addressing these as we go along. He runs into a kind of an interesting aside here about, in a way, surfacing some of the secret sins. And this is a theme that we already went to before with the men who get away with things and live scot-free while putting a burden on the women who are meant to bear a double burden for the sin and the secrecy or silence of their sin. So he asks in this time, he's like, I wish that there was some kind of great-hearted, pure-bodied Milton who could write some words, manly words, to make mad the guilty, to appall the free, to bring these things in a way to the surface of the conscience of these people, to make them feel their shame, and not just the shame of the sins, but the shame of ungentlemanly unmanliness, to let a woman carry the sacrifice for a man of the sin. So this is obviously the case of Catherine Weir and her obviously gentleman person who took advantage of her, and it's also the echo of the earlier tale. So we're back into that theme of men getting away with things, but again, if those things just lay dormant underneath the social structures that are accepted or underneath individual inertia, they're not going to be dealt with. So he feels the vicar's role is that, it's is the theme, of course, in Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter, where, the whole tale is trying to bring to the surface the horrors of this guy whose sin is basically crushing this other woman's life, right? And so he doesn't want him to get away with it. And sometimes we're sympathizing with the sinner, and sometimes with the one who's hunting the sinner to bring him out into the light. So again, the vicar's sentiment is this is required. A pure, great-hearted, pure-bodied, manly Milton type to kind of really bring them into their own. And maybe we're sort of like saying, a Milton-like writer, like himself, like MacDonald. Just tell the truth to people, and they'll have their conscience woken up, like a sleeping dog. So this this thing is also spoken of as a kind of um, disquiet, maybe in himself, though. So when we start seeing him probe the relationship between these things that are hidden in himself and others, he does take a slightly different tack. He is fair in a sense that he's saying the devil and the vicar as well, but he comes to the awareness of it, the self-awareness of it, slowly in front of us. So I think that this is not accidental on MacDonald's part. So again, once again, he said, "What a fearful thing would it have been for me to have found my mind so full of my own cares that I was unable to do God's work and bear my neighbor's burden. But even then, I would have cried to him and said, I know thee that thou art not a hard master." And this is obviously an inversion of the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, where the guy who hid his talent in the ground comes to him and says, I knew you were a hard man, sowing where you didn't reap, reaping where you didn't sow. And so I hid it, and here's what's your own. So this uh, posture towards God, or perceiving of God, looking at him with a gracious eye, is an interesting input from MacDonald. Even if he gets it wrong in his actions, even if there's something here now, this disquiet that's beginning to affect him, he is not perceiving God as someone who's going to whack him for it, but as someone who is uh, aware of his emotional frailty and not just tolerant of it, like, oh, let's get past this nuisance of your emotionality, but understands us to be emotional beings to the core. We are this. And I think that's what he's going to try to flesh out or turn over for us, is that we aren't just, our emotions aren't just a thing to get past or, you know, kind of get around or hide. They are things that are us, a part of us. So whatever that relationship is between faith and actions and feeling, it's much more integral than we've been imagining. We can't have the one faith without feeling. How would it be, if you're elsewhere he says, how would it be if you said, yes, I love my mother, it's my duty. So that's a good case example of what happens when you have just the actions, the correct actions from, and faithfulness without the feeling. We wouldn't want God to think of us in those ways, he says elsewhere, right? That he loves us is the essence of the way we think of him looking at us. His countenance is turned towards us. So he, of course, however, in this whole process, does discover that his disquiet has disrupted his duty to his parishioners. And some of this is helpful because he says, for example, when he's approaching Catherine Weir, I could not help saying to myself, I took a step or two towards her. What is thy trouble to hers? So there's something shifting in him because as his own suffering kind of turmoil churns in him, he's able to perceive and understand the suffering of others empathically, and well as to acknowledge others as more severe. So that comparison isn't even possible if you're not really aware of your own suffering. The other example of his response to his interventions is, you will not leave me alone, which it is too bad. This is identical to Thomas Weir's You Go Too Far. And he has in this kind of notion the kind of hounds of heaven, and they're not going to give up on Catherine Weir. But it's a severe hunting of her in a way in the dark. It's a very dark scene, because he goes at her intervening in such a way that he wants her to know her wrong. And of course, we think of all the ways in which that's still part of the system where men are blaming the women, the victims in the process. And, but him saying, have you done no wrong? Was it all him? Don't seek refuge in the cant about a woman's weakness. Have you not also wronged God by not protecting what was not yours to lose, but his? And then have you wronged the man who wronged you by letting him get away with it instead of redeeming him through your purity, essentially? And this was in intense. We get to a very dark phase where she runs off. We think she's going to kill herself. And after that, he's like, should I not have tried again and yet again to waken thy love, and then a sweet and healing shame like that of her who bathed the master's feet with her tears would have bred fresh love and no wrath? So basically kind of wondering, maybe my poor sister, I was a little hard on you. I was so fierce. So he's beginning to question it. And yet, even then, he's still saying, but my motives were pure. My I was telling them the truth, but I was just being harsh. So this is an interesting kind of, again, evolution of his self-awareness. When my tongue spoke the hardest things I could find, my heart was yearning over her. If I could not but make her feel that she too had been wrong, maybe that sympathy of her own wrongness would bring about forgiveness. And thus I reasoned with myself as I followed her back in the darkness. So the modeling of the severe brooding care to instill self-awareness of sin, maybe it'll lead to a fellow feeling, maybe that'll lead to forgiveness. He's trying things. He describes the condition of repentance in organic terms as new, fresh life bursting from poor, old, dried conditions of the heart. So he's earlier we saw him use the analogy of the surgeon, but here this organic metaphor of like there's kind of death and winter. And what we really need is to just jar it into spring. And when she gets to the point where she says, "What does it matter?" and he realizes how deep her despair is, and it went right to his heart. And then, of course, he's followed by um, the little episode with Gerard where he's wondering about this little kid who basically kind of has carved a little soft spot in his heart. Thank heavens, um, the little darling is making him tender in a way that he realizes he probably should have been with Catherine. So remember when he puts Gerard to bed and says in his heart, it's not much like painting the sky yet, right? Referring back to that earlier image of what the kid wanted to do, be assigned as God's painter and help him with the sky. But who knows? And as I uttered the commonplace question in my mind it was suddenly changed into the half of a great dim prophecy by the answer, which rose to it there, for the answer was God. So this again is starting to change his posture. This tenderness is opening up a possibility of tender love, imaginative hope, sort of a very beautiful image for the other, which is a little different from that intense pursuing um, care, right? And this prayerful inquiry for the future of this child. And it's answered, or rather, like the constant, unconditioned, uninstigated care of God is perceived somehow in that moment, in that posture, because he's tender and raw. Um, and then that itself becomes the answer. God was always there, caring. It's the answer of Job. It's not God scolding. It's I've always been here caring, and and that tenderness is starting to crack him open a little bit. So later he talks about this in more specific terms where he's saying God lives nonetheless, his will is better than mine. He's hidden and it's a perfected will, and him is my life. His will is done. And then is my trouble compared to hers. I will not sink into it and be selfish. But this sad misery that he's depicting uh, with association with Catherine Weir, he says is not just a misery that she's in, but a misery that she's become. Her suffering is not can't be compared then to his own. So once people are beyond that, and his perception is beginning to see a suffering that goes beyond his own, it's one with her person. She's not in misery, she is misery. She is the man of sorrow. And the death of hope in her person is like sunless earth, the hard, undifferentiated mass. So we're talking, cold death of a heatless universe, right? But worse, a loveless universe. So he's beginning to see that that's possible. He does in the end take us there himself, right? Because at some point he even says in his own misery that he cares for nothing, right? He can't even imagine that the sun ever shone, that there was a thing called summer that will come back again. So he gets really depressed in that, and his own misery almost gets to that same level of despair. Like it's really inconceivable that a thing that's so absurd and poetic as a summer would be a reality. And further still, that Miss Oldcastle would return to him. She's so far away from him, further than the summer is from this bitter cold, miserable winter that he's going through. So this is something that's really um, beautiful, kind of in a way that's wrenching him open as a process in the process. And he begins to kind of interact with his parishioners in a way where you begin to see him repent by repenting to Thomas. This whole, I'm going to go back to my work. Um, what if, he says, what if that face of hers was doomed ever to bring with it such a pain, to be ever to me no more than a lovely vision radiating grief? If so, I would endure in silence and as patiently as I could, trying to make up for the lack of brightness of my own fate by causing more brightness in the fate of others. I would at least keep on trying to do my work. And this, for him, of course, is the turning of the countenance of the worst kind of human suffering. That Catherine's father turns his face away from her, that God should turn his face from us. So may he turn his face to you and give you peace. But this is the opposite. So returning his attempt to soldier on here, and I'm just going to press on, work at my duty, even if this mortification that he's felt to his soul, this rejection by Miss Oldcastle, shakes him to the core. And once again, we say with to him, you just tried that, it doesn't work. But he is probing to get down to a more honest, authentic integration of emotion and duty here. He does have a tender moment when the child comes up to him and grabs him by the hand when he's in that condition too, and it kind of gives him a sense of security, like he's being held by God and he will be taken care of in his heart as well as his mind and his conscience. So once again, we have there the feelings, the actions, and the knowledge or faith. There is a weird little aside about an organ that he wishes were animate. And I think this is really about him talking about the quality. It is a beautiful thought experiment, which is not the first time he's talking about it. Earlier, he talks about it with the physicality of the church being almost a living spirit. But here he's talking about the quality generated when the music moves us, might be imagined to come from itself, integrated as a life from the form of the organ. So wishing this animation of objects in the holy space of the church spills over from this overabundance, superabundance of vitality that itself can't be denied. Superabundance of vitality is a reality of the created order. God made, and God is superabundant in his life-giving spirit. So, but this is something else. Like he's if we wonder then what he's hinting at about himself then, because he spells out clearly, like, it's just a thought, it's just an imagining. I don't really think that the organ is alive. I just wonder what it's like, because that organ is dependent on human will and motivation and feeling being played through it. So I have a feeling that he's really talking about our own animation by a higher will, higher love, higher beauty. And he unpacks this pretty clearly by almost theological creed. He says God had created all our worships, reverences, tendernesses, loves, that they had come out of his heart, and he had made them in us because they were in him first. That otherwise he would not have cared to make them. That all we could imagine of the wise, the lovely, the beautiful was in him, only infinitely more of them than we could not merely imagine, but understand, even if he did all he could to explain them to us, to make us understand them. That in him was all the wise teaching of the best man ever known in the world, and more. All the grace and gentleness and truth of the best child, and more. All the tenderness and devotion of the truest type of womankind, and more. For there is a love that passes the love of a woman, not the love of Jonathan to David, though David said so, but the love of God to the men and women whom he has made. So we begin to see him struggle, reach theologically to kind of get an answer to this question. What's the relationship between, and all romantics address it, what is the relationship between these things that we feel, these lesser loves? Are they just mere intrusions into my duty? Are they something more? These worships, reverences, tendernesses, loves. And obviously included in that is his love for Miss Oldcastle. And he's stretching for God is the source. God is the infinite form from which all our loves derive and flow and return to him. So his despair does increase until he gets his intervention from Old Rogers. And interestingly, the Old Rogers gives us a story about um, basically the gist of which is there are just as many bad days as good days. And he admits is that, that's not a really deeply Christian answer. That's pretty pagan. There are good days and there's bad days, but don't, it's still foolish to believe that all the days will be bad, as much as it's foolish to believe that all the days would be good. And instead, we need to hope in God because He is the lifter of our countenance and our God. And I think that that's kind of where he, again, is moving deeper towards a faith that could it be a faith that's big enough to contain even my deepest disappointments, my deepest hurts, the face of the one I love turning away from me. He brings us into that last chapter with a kind of weird aside with two people we haven't met before. And some of it is plot driven in the sense that we now are at the limits of what he can get because he can't pursue the plot any further based on his own character, and it's the limits of his own conscientiousness that doesn't allow us into deeper knowledge of the old castles. So we're stuck, and so we need some more characters who know some stuff about them. So we need these two old ladies, um, old gentle ladies of the parish. But within that, he also unpacks some of the moral theologizing. So once again, going at some of the more reductionist Alexander Pope like explanations of the relationship between duty and action and faith and feeling. And of course, he gets his pot shot in there to call Pope a small man morally, um, unlike Shakespeare, who's full head, hands, and heart. But at the end of it, an interesting thing happens. They push the wrong button. He gets up to go because they start talking about Ethelwyn as maybe she might not be right in the head, and they're not saying a lot of nice things in general. And he gets up to kind of, uh, in a way, the only thing you can do is just leave in those kind of contexts, exit from a ungracious context, and in a way to defend her honor. Something wakes up again in him. It brings his love for her to the level of a petition to God that he might rescue her. And I find this fascinating because it's almost like he was at despair. Like I care for nothing. There's nothing in there. I can't imagine that the summer will ever come again. And yet it's like the romantic courtesy was the first thing to wake up in him. That thing woke up before all the other emotions and sentiments that maybe we thought should have been there first or sooner. But such a gentleman, wakes up in his feeling for her rescue. And I find that just interesting as a plot, and also just interesting in the revelation of MacDonald. So where does he left us then with all of this? I don't think he gave us real clear, simplistic answers, and I think that's the point. He's clear that God has created all of our worships, reverences, tendernesses, and loves. They all come out of his heart. And God's love is beyond that. All ours are images. At some level, they point to, but don't just point to. They also are real in themselves. So there are many kinds of signs. A symbol that is just a road sign doesn't say, I am a stop sign. And by the way, stop. It just says stop. That's one kind of sign. But an image says, behold me. And the more you behold me, you behold what I am pointing to through me and beyond me, which is the God and the love of God that I am imaging. So this love that is a torment to him, a distraction from his duty, is also the thing that is potentially driving really his duty and his love for God and changing it in a very deep way. For MacDonald, our loves are the means and the mode of our expression of love for God. They aren't annoying interruptions. They're secondary only in source, and they can't derive from themselves any more than an organ can move of its own animation. They're secondary in that they could steer all our lives and affections towards the proper ends and proportions in God. All the inklings take up this theme: subcreation, coherence, the four loves, made in the image of a maker God. All these things are not easily reduced or simplified. We can't hijack or bypass or hack ourselves so we can avoid our emotions. And they have to be somehow integrated in a holistic picture of our lesser loves and our deeper, truer loves. Charles Williams summarizes his take on it and in this kind of paradox of believing that this love, the thing in front of you, this is thou, but this also is not thou. That kind of posture towards every kind of love that comes into our life is a way to deny it the equivalency of love of God, but also to acknowledge that it is essentially from God. God invented our hearts and made this little love to point to his. And all of our loves, while we're in love, are able to be transferred to their proper object and impetus and quality in, by, and for God because we love. You can't just sort of say, well, I want to get past the little loves and get back to the real love. You can't get around it. You only can go through. And Williams also says something about a building an altar, but the fire falling on somebody else's altar. This exchange of love is the work of the Spirit. And I think MacDonald is pushing us into these real questions of these things. You can't let go of his love for Ethelwyn because they're forming his hope and love and faith. And you can't pretend that that vision of the snowflower is not the thing that's moving his will, his intentions, and his feelings. We can obviously misread the signs. You can misread what a thing means because of the state that we're in, because of the posture they're in, because of the way we're feeling, because of 1,000 things that intervene. But if we realize that our faith, hope, and love, almost seem to move of themselves, it's because there's a God behind our loves, the will of God in which our wills are hidden, the life of God in which we live. God is not just operative in the world through his doctrines or facts or things like that, but directly by his Spirit, will to will, love to love, hope to hope, faith to faith, person to person, spirit to spirit. So that constant, unconditioned, uninstigated care of God is somehow perceived by us, not in spite of our emotions, but in the midst of the 1,000 things and faith, the 1,000 things that we're subject to in this world. So I'll leave it at that. I think that's kind of the depth of spiritual exploration he wants to lead us into. He doesn't keep himself from sacrificing his narrator in the process to expose how real these things are and not to be taken lightly.